AM 1460, the new WXBR. You are listening to the Metro South Morning Show, PM in the AM. Peter Czymbor here with you on this Wednesday morning. And joining me now via the telephone is the author of Nothin to Lose, The Making of Kiss, 1972 to 1975. We welcome in author Ken Sharp. Ken, good morning and welcome to the program.
Good morning.
Ken, you co-authored this book about the band Kiss along with members of Kiss, Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley. Tell us the process of getting this book off the ground, working with those two characters.
Yeah, well, I've done work with Kiss through the years. I contributed to. I was the co-author of a book that came out in the early 2000s called Behind the Mask, and I've worked with the band on various things, whether it's tour books or DVDs or box sets and things like that. But this was a project that I brought to Gene Simmons. I had the idea of doing something. I've always been fascinated with the beginning of things. I'm a big Elvis and Beatles fan, so, whether it's Elvis playing juke joints down south before he made it, before he was even signed to Sun, or when he was signed to Sun Records, or the Beatles, basically building their repertoire and their fan base initially in Hamburg. I always found that to be a real fascinating subject. And with Kiss, I thought it would be really interesting to kind of follow the trajectory of them starting out as kind of this freak show that was laughed at by everyone, and kind of how they got to where they were and how they actually broke through and achieved a one-in-a-million dream.
Let's talk about the beginning of Kiss, since that's what the book is about, but let's talk about it in this context particularly, because when you think of Kiss, you think of big stage shows, you think of fireworks, pyrotechnics, drinking blood, spitting blood, a lot of theatrics, and it's hard to imagine that in a small club setting, but Kiss had to get there, start somewhere.
Yeah. Initially everything was on a bare bones level. Gene wasn't blowing fire or spitting blood, and there certainly wasn't fire in any of these clubs or things like that. But they really started out, very, very small, with a one or two person road crew, if you could even call them that. But what was interesting with Kiss is when they did get signed to Casablanca, and they started opening for acts, everyone from Aerosmith to Argent to Redbone, Black Oak, Arkansas. They actually were equipped with a much more extravagant stage show than the headliner. Their label Casablanca put so much money into them that they were blowing people off stage primarily because of the stage show and looking so different, but also because of the kind of the four to the floor, simplistic, almost Neanderthalish style hard rock, which certainly was effective. So they really had that idea from the beginning, whether or not they could financially support themselves to do that. They had the idea of basically putting on a show that they never saw. They never saw anyone do something like that. They were certainly influenced by people like Alice Cooper and the crazy world of Arthur Brown, and particularly Slade. But they really were able to put their own spin on it and dream big.
Now, they were a band that had to get their start somewhere and had to play clubs here and there, but their stage show was always big. There was never a situation in the early days of Kiss where they were playing acoustic guitars with no makeup, right? No, definitely not. Definitely not. No, Kiss, it was basically 1 to 100 in a pretty quick stead, and the stage show was something that really drove them in live performance. We're chatting with Ken Sharp, the author of Nothin to Lose, The Making of Kiss, 1972 to 1975 here on AM 1460, the new WXBR. You mentioned Kiss's record label in the early days, Casablanca Records, put a lot of money behind them. Correct me if I'm wrong, that was predominantly a disco label in the 70s.
Well, not necessarily. Initially they were the first act signed, but they were a label where it was a lot of black sheep. You certainly had Donna Summer, and you had the Village People. But then you had acts like Kiss, and you had power pop act like the Hudson Brothers, who had their own TV show, or you had kind of a prog hard rock act like Angel on the label. So the label actually was a little more multifaceted than just being a disco label. Parliament Funkadelic was also on the label. So what I would say is they kind of attracted a lot of the black sheeps and were able to launch the careers of some great artists, some of the ones I mentioned, whether it's Parliament or Donna Summer or Kiss.
Now, who were some of the bands and acts that Kiss opened up for in the early days, and as you would say, they blew them off stage?
Well, yeah, well, I wouldn't say they blew Aerosmith off stage, but there were certainly acts that the road crews were getting into fights because Kiss was doing so well. You know, one was Black Oak, Arkansas. The other was Argent, Wishbone Ash. So many different acts that they played with later in their career. Right before I think the Live album was just released. The Live, they actually took one or two opening slots for Black Sabbath. By that time, Kiss was mainly headlining, but they figured, that they were a big influence on Kiss, and they thought it would be a good thing for them to do for their career. And that's certainly a show where they really gave the headliner such a run for the money that Ozzy supposedly told them later that he was scared to follow them.
And this is strung out end of Black Sabbath Ozzy, right?
Well, this is Ozzy 1975 Ozzy.
1975 Ozzy. So
yeah, whatever album that would be.
You got some dogs joining us on the interview this morning, Ken?
I do. They only talk with barks occasionally.
Well, that's okay. They can join in as well. We're chatting with Ken Sharp, author of Nothin to Lose, The Making of Kiss, 1972 to 1975 here on AM 1460, the new WXBR. How did their stage show get more extravagant as time went on? This book covers pretty much a 3-year period of the band.
Well, I think it was, as the record sold and as the label was able to funnel more money into it, they were able to become more extravagant with their stage show. But I actually think it became much more extravagant after they made it. This book basically ends with the release and success of their live album, Alive, in the fall of 1975. And by that point, there were Gene was blowing fire, and he was certainly spitting blood, and there was certainly some fire that was being used in their shows, and Peter Criss's drum kit levitated. Ace Frehley's guitar smoked. This is the non-PC era. But laterally, the shows became even more extravagant post what this book covers, and I think that was just a matter of having much more money to be able to put on more extravagant shows. What's interesting for me is to see, I'm a big Beatle fan, and to see Paul McCartney perform, and when you see him perform Live and Let Die, you see the sparklers and the walls of flames, and basically you're seeing what Kiss did almost 30 years ago, so it's kind of interesting. The Beatles were one of the biggest influences on Kiss, which people may find hard to believe, but they're all huge fans of the Beatles, and for them to see a little bit of an influence rubbing off on someone like Paul McCartney must be kind of surreal.
Now, when you take a look at the band Kiss from 1972 to 1975, you obviously studied the band throughout their entire career, and particularly this era for this book. Correct me if I am wrong, but Kiss was almost considered a live cult band up until the release of the Alive album. Their studio albums didn't particularly set the world on fire in terms of sales.
Yeah, no, you're completely right. The first 3 Kiss albums, Kiss, Hotter Than Hell, and Dressed to Kill, while really, really good records, actually, which include some of their best material, did not take off, and they garnered very little radio airplay. It was Kiss's reputation on the live circuit as this really ferocious, hungry band that you just had to see. This was something that certainly didn't translate on record, and that's what pushed them over the top. And ironically, it was the live album, Alive, the double LP set that came out in 75, that was a record that really represented that ferocity that perhaps the studio albums lacked, and that's the album that pushed them over the top.
Is there any other band you can think of off the top of your head where their defining album was a live album like Kiss?
Yeah, I mean, Peter Frampton is an example.
Certainly.
Frampton Comes Alive, I would think that he was one. To a lesser extent, you have Ted Nugent with Double Live Gonzo. You have
one of our good friends here at the show.
Oh, good. You have a great hard rock band from the late that put out a great live album in the late 70s. UFO, they had an album called Strangers in the Night.
I was wondering if you were going to mention that when I asked that question, actually, because I actually love the UFO Strangers in the Night album.
Yeah, and that's absolutely a fabulous album. In fact, they did some shows. They opened some shows for Kiss. and I think that pushed them over the top a bit in the States. Obviously, they never made the huge breakthrough that they deserved. But I think live albums, with Frampton and Kiss, became almost de rigueur for other acts. You had Aerosmith with Live Bootleg, and you had other acts releasing live albums, kind of taking advantage of that popularity of the form.
Now let's talk about an issue which is somewhat time sensitive. Last week, it was announced the bands that have been nominated to potentially be inducted into this year's class of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and Kiss was on the ballot. They're a band that for many years people have felt have been snubbed from the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Why do you think that is so, and do you think that their time is forthcoming that they'll get in?
I really hope they get in. I'm still not so sure. I'm not so optimistic because, a lot of the Kiss fans are really excited, but they were nominated years ago too, and they didn't get in. They obviously nominate a lot more acts than can be inducted. I think Kiss is just such a polarizing band, and certainly for a lot of the more serious critics that are on that committee, including Dave Marsh, who's actually publicly gone out years ago and saying that he'll do anything he can to keep Kiss from getting in, which I find pretty ridiculous and pretty awful that someone in that power on a committee would be able to say something like that and retain his position on said committee. I certainly hope they get in. They certainly deserve it. With just the influence they've had on people, whether it's everyone from Soundgarden to Pearl Jam to the Foo Fighters. There's so many people that have cited Kiss as an influence. Lady Gaga. So it really navigates a wide terrain. And I'm not saying that everything Kiss wrote was on Beatles level. In fact, nothing was on the Beatles level, but you can't really put anyone on that level. But they certainly wrote their share of really impactful, anthemic hard rock classics. There's a lot more to Kiss than just the makeup and the costumes and the wild stage show. The run of albums through the 70s really stands up with the best of hard rock for its time.
Three of the four bands you just mentioned, or three of the four acts, I should say, that you just mentioned that cite Kiss as big influences on their career. Interestingly enough, you mentioned the Foo Fighters, Pearl Jam, and Soundgarden. Those three acts really don't have a big stage show. Lady Gaga, you mentioned, certainly very theatrical in her concert presentation. Do you think that the theatrical nature of Kiss's stage show has taken away from the content of a lot of their music, and some of the critics just can't see past the fireworks and face paint and don't want anything to do with them in the Hall of Fame?
Yeah, no, I think that's completely the case, and I think if you really don't go beyond it, and you just basically look at the surface of it, you're gonna tag them as that, just basically a band of kind of bozos who dress up in makeup and just perform an extravagant stage show to take away the fact they have no musical talent. But I think that if you actually delve deeper into it, this band's been around for 40 years. You can't survive on a gimmick that long. There has to be some quality to back it up. And I really do think that they have the quality in a lot of their music, especially the classic era from 74 to, I'd say probably through the complete era where they wore the makeup to the last album, Creatures of the Night. I would say that era is pretty pristine in terms of some really, really great, impactful, infectious, fun, hedonistic, anthemic rock and roll.
We're chatting with Ken Sharp, author of Nothin to Lose, The Making of Kiss, 1972 to 1975, co-author of this book, alongside Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley. What is the current touring incarnation of Kiss? Obviously, you got Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley. They're the core of what Kiss is, but it's not Ace Frehley playing guitar anymore. I think it's Tommy Thayer, if I'm not mistaken. And who's playing drums these days for Kiss?
Eric Singer, who's actually been with the band on and off. He first started performing with the band on their Revenge album. He joined the band at that period because Eric Carr, their previous drummer, was sick and tragically later died of cancer.
And by the way, the Revenge album for non-makeup era Kiss is actually a pretty solid album.
It is. It's actually a record that was produced by Bob Ezrin, who also produced their Elder album and their classic Destroyer album. And Bob obviously is an amazing producer who had great success with Pink Floyd, The Wall, and produced all the killer Alice Cooper albums from the 70s. I would agree with you. I would say Revenge is the strongest, if not one of the strongest, non-makeup albums. But yeah, so that's the touring lineup. The guys in the band really get along, and they're all on the same page. They've recorded 2 albums together, 2 studio albums, Sonic Boom and Monster. Monster, the last album, was actually really, really good, and Sonic Boom was quite good as well. And they're considering recording some new music as well. So it's a lineup that continues to play to audiences around the world. In fact, right now the band's performing shows in Japan.
And the reason why I brought up the touring members of the band currently is because I'm getting very much ahead of myself, Ken, right here. But let's just say they are inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And I feel like their time has to come eventually where they get in. You can't keep them out forever. The fans would go crazy. I don't know if you saw last year at the induction when Rush got in, but they had more fans there, bar none, compared to any of the other acts. And that was because they were snubbed for so long that it just seemed like the time was right. I think that time is coming for Kiss. And the reason why I mentioned the touring members of the band is I have to imagine that when they go into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, Ace Frehley and Peter Criss got to be right there with Paul and Gene.
Well, I think they'll be there if the band gets inducted. Whether they play together is another.
See, that was my next question.
Another animal. I mean, Gene actually recently was asked about it and said they won't play together. But there's still time if they get inducted and they talk to the guys and they think that they can deal with jamming with them on a song or two, could happen. I hope if they did get inducted that they would play together. Leave all that stuff behind.
Is there bad blood between those guys?
What's that?
Is there bad blood between those guys, the former members of Kiss and the current members, Gene Simmons and Paul?
I think there is some bad blood.
What was the falling out about?
Paul and Ace and Peter. There definitely is some bad blood. But I think there's, beyond the bad blood, I do think there's a lot of love there. I think that perhaps is buried a little further underneath. But I do think that there is that balance of that. I think Gene and Paul are frustrated that Ace and Peter, as great as they are, did not come through in the manner they wished when they reunited, and they kind of resorted to a lot of the same issues that plagued them when they were originally in the band. And I think they kind of decry that fact that the guys couldn't stick around for the full Monty.
Well, I think money talks. You know that well, knowing Gene Simmons, and at some point, money might talk them into doing something. Once again, we're chatting with Ken Sharp, author of Nothing to Lose, The Making of Kiss, 1972 to 1975. Ken, any final words for our listeners this morning in relation to this book, and what other projects do you have in the works?
What I could say is, it was a great pleasure to work on the book. I interviewed over 200 people, so you're not just getting the story from Kiss, you're getting it from their producers, their engineers, their roadies, their folks that worked at the record company, people that did their costumes, artwork design, journalists. So basically, if you know the story of Kiss, this is a new way to look at it, because I brought in a huge canvas of other people that really broaden the story and kind of really bring you there and evoke a sense of time and place. So I'm real happy about that. If you're interested in Kiss, or you're interested in how a band like this made themselves into such a phenomenon, check out the book. As for other projects, I'm finishing up a book on the 60s session players from California called The Wrecking Crew.
I'm a big Beach Boys fan, so I'm familiar.
Yeah, me too. I just saw Brian Wilson with Jeff Beck 2 days ago at the Greek Theater. It was amazing. Brian performed the entirety of Pet Sounds. So that's an interesting book, and that's a similar format to the one that I did with Kiss. It's an oral history format. But yeah, it's a really cool book. Brian Wilson did the foreword, and Glenn Campbell did the afterword for the book, and I interviewed a ton of not just the Wrecking Crew players, but the artists that they played for, whether it was Nancy Sinatra or the Beach Boys or the Turtles or the Righteous Brothers or various folks like that.
The Wrecking Crew, for the record, are in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, I believe.
They may well be.
That's Ken Sharp joining us here on AM 1460, the new WXBR. Ken, we'll have to have you on again sometime.
I enjoyed it. Great to talk to you.
You're listening to the Metro South Morning Show, PM in the AM. We'll step aside for a quick break. Back with more of the program after this.